The hotel confirmation email glowed on my phone screen at 2 in the morning while I sat in my kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device. In 72 hours, I was supposed to board a plane to Santa Fe for the first vacation I'd taken in 8 years. But the group text that had woken me up 15 minutes ago made it clear that wasn't going to happen. My daughter Jennifer's words still burned behind my eyelids. "Mom, we already told Amanda's parents you'd watch the kids that week. You can't back out now. Just reschedule your trip." As if my life, my plans, my dreams were nothing more than pencil marks on a calendar that could be erased whenever it suited them. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I stared at the string of messages from my 3 children, each one more dismissive than the last. They'd planned this, coordinated it, used my granddaughter's birthday party as bait to get me to commit to being available, then casually mentioned they'd all booked a cruise together. For the same week. The week I'd circled in red on my calendar 6 months ago. The week I'd scrimped and saved for, denying myself new shoes and restaurant meals so I could afford one small luxury for myself. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 months earlier, the woman who would have canceled everything without a second thought, who would have apologized for being selfish. That woman was gone now, and what was about to unfold would prove it. 3 months earlier, I'd been standing in almost this exact spot, making pancakes for my youngest son David when he stopped by unannounced on a Tuesday morning. At 62, I'd become the family's default gathering place, the kitchen where everyone felt entitled to show up and expect a meal. David had barely said hello before launching into his request. His startup needed an investor, just $20,000, and he had big plans to pay me back within 6 months. I'd smiled and flipped the pancakes, my mind already calculating which part of my modest retirement savings I could tap without triggering penalties. This was what mothers did, wasn't it? We sacrificed. We supported. We said yes even when our bank accounts screamed no. My late husband Tom had left me comfortable enough, not rich by any means, but stable. A small house in Austin's suburbs paid off. A retirement account that would carry me through if I was careful. A part-time job at the library that kept me busy and gave me spending money. I'd raised 3 children on less and made it work through sheer determination and countless nights of worry. Surely I could help my son now. The thing about being the family matriarch is that nobody questions your strength until you try to claim a piece of it for yourself. For years, I'd been the one everyone called when they needed something. Jennifer needed me to watch her kids every Thursday because her yoga instructor only taught that evening. My middle child, Robert, called me when his washing machine broke, expecting me to either fix it or pay for a new one. David treated my kitchen like a restaurant and my wallet like an ATM. And I'd enabled it all, convinced that this was love, that sacrifice without boundaries was the highest form of maternal devotion. My friends at the library had tried to tell me otherwise. "Margaret," my co-worker Susan would say, "you're allowed to have a life too." But I'd always brushed it off with a laugh and changed the subject. What did they know about the bond between a mother and her children? The truth was, I was terrified that if I stopped giving, they'd stop needing me. And if they stopped needing me, what purpose did I serve? My identity had become so tangled up in their wants and demands that I'd forgotten I was a person with my own desires, my own dreams that had nothing to do with anyone else's convenience. The Santa Fe trip had started as a fantasy, the kind of daydream you indulge in while sitting in traffic or folding laundry. I'd seen a travel documentary about the art galleries and the high desert landscape, the way the sunset painted the adobe buildings in shades of amber and rose. Something about it called to me, whispered promises of peace and beauty and space to breathe. For weeks, I'd researched hotels and hiking trails, planned which galleries I'd visit, imagined myself sitting in a cafe with a sketchbook because maybe, just maybe, I could remember what it felt like to create something just for the joy of it. I'd been an art major in college before I'd gotten pregnant with Jennifer and traded oil paints for diaper changes. The deposit on the hotel had felt reckless and thrilling, a secret act of rebellion I'd committed on a Saturday morning after David had canceled our lunch plans for the 3rd time that month. I hadn't told my children about it right away. Some part of me already knew they'd find a way to make me feel guilty about it, so I'd kept it to myself like a precious stone hidden in my pocket. When I finally mentioned it at Jennifer's house during a family dinner 2 months ago, the response had been lukewarm at best. "That's nice, Mom," Jennifer had said, barely looking up from her phone. Robert had made a joke about me becoming a hippie in my old age. David had asked if I could lend him my car while I was gone because his had been making a weird noise and he didn't want to deal with it. Not one of them had asked why I wanted to go, what I hoped to find there, whether I was excited or nervous. The conversation had moved on to Jennifer's promotion at work and Robert's son's soccer tournament. I'd sat there picking at my salad, feeling invisible despite being surrounded by the people I'd given my entire life to. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're present in body, but absent in importance. Just a supporting character in everyone else's story? That dinner was when the first crack appeared in my carefully constructed belief that my children valued me beyond what I could do for them. But I'd pushed the feeling down, told myself I was being dramatic and overly sensitive. The real trouble started 3 weeks before my trip, when Jennifer called with what she described as exciting news. She and her husband Marcus, along with Robert and his wife, and David and his girlfriend, had all decided to book a last-minute cruise. They'd found an amazing deal, and it had been so long since they'd all taken a vacation together. As adults, without kids. Wasn't that great? My stomach had clenched even before she said it, some primal instinct warning me what was coming next. "The only thing is," Jennifer had continued, her voice taking on that wheedling tone I'd learned to dread, "it's the same week you're supposed to go to Santa Fe, and Amanda's parents were going to watch the kids, but her dad just found out he needs a minor surgery that week. Nothing serious, but he won't be up for chasing 3 kids around, you know?" The silence on my end must have lasted too long, because she'd rushed to fill it. "I mean, you could probably reschedule your trip, right? It's just a hotel reservation. We've already paid deposits for the cruise and coordinated time off work. It would be so much harder for us to change everything." The words had tumbled out of her mouth with such casual entitlement, as if my plans were made of tissue paper and theirs were carved in stone. I'd wanted to say no right then. The word had formed on my tongue, sharp and clear, but decades of conditioning had kicked in, and instead I'd heard myself say, "Let me think about it." Jennifer had taken that as a yes, of course, because I'd never truly said no to any of them in their entire lives. Why would I start now? She'd already begun explaining the kids' schedules, who needed to be where and when, what foods they would and wouldn't eat, which streaming services had their favorite shows. The information had washed over me like a cold wave, each detail another small weight, added to the crushing pressure in my chest. After we hung up, I'd sat in my car in the library parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. A woman in the next car had glanced over at me with concern, probably wondering if I was having a medical emergency. In a way, I was. Something inside me was dying, that last stubborn part that had believed my children saw me as a person rather than a resource to be exploited. But even then, even with that realization burning in my gut, I'd almost convinced myself to cancel the trip. Almost. My friend Susan had been the one to stop me from caving immediately. We'd been shelving books in the quiet of the library's back room when I'd told her about the situation, trying to keep my voice steady and failing. "They expect you to cancel a trip you've been planning for months so they can go on a cruise they just decided to book?" Susan had said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Margaret, do you hear yourself? Do you hear how insane that sounds?" I'd made excuses, of course. They were family. The kids needed supervision. What was I supposed to do? Let my grandchildren suffer because I wanted to be selfish? Susan had put down the book she was holding and looked at me with something between pity and frustration. "Those children have 3 sets of parents. Your kids could hire a babysitter. They could take turns with the other grandparents. They could, heaven forbid, not go on their cruise. But they won't do any of those things because you've taught them they don't have to. You've taught them that your life, your happiness, your plans don't matter as much as theirs." The words had hit like physical blows, each one landing in a place that was already bruised and tender. "They're going to keep taking and taking until there's nothing left of you," Susan had said softly. "And then they'll be confused about why you're bitter and resentful in your old age." That conversation had planted a seed that grew in the days that followed. Susan had invited me to her house that weekend, something we'd done occasionally over the 5 years we'd worked together. But this time felt different. Her home was small but beautifully decorated, filled with art she'd collected from her own travels, books stacked on every surface, plants thriving in terracotta pots by the windows. We'd sat on her back porch with glasses of iced tea, and she'd told me about her own journey to setting boundaries with her family. "I had a sister who treated me like a bank for years," Susan had said, her eyes focused on something far away. "I kept lending her money, thinking I was helping, but I was actually enabling her to avoid growing up, avoid taking responsibility for her own choices." She turned to look at me then, her expression serious. "The day I finally said no, she didn't speak to me for 8 months. 8 months, Margaret. And you know what? It was the best thing that ever happened to our relationship. Because when she finally came back, she came back as an equal. She'd figured out her own problems. She'd learned she was capable of more than she thought. And she respected me in a way she never had before." I'd listened to Susan's story, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name. "But what if they don't come back?" I'd asked, voicing the fear that kept me awake at night. "What if I say no, and they decide I'm not worth the trouble?" Susan had reached over and squeezed my hand, her grip firm and warm. "Then they were never really seeing you in the first place," she'd said quietly. "They were seeing a service you provided. And Margaret, you are so much more than that. You're brilliant and creative and funny. You have interests and talents that have nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother. Don't you want to find out who you are when you're not constantly giving yourself away?" The question had lodged itself in my chest like a splinter, painful and impossible to ignore. Who was I beneath all the roles I played? I'd been a mother for so long that I genuinely didn't know anymore. The woman who'd loved painting and hiking, who'd read poetry and dreamed of traveling through Europe, who'd once stayed up all night having passionate debates about art and philosophy with friends in college, where had she gone? When had I last done something purely because it brought me joy, with no thought to how it might serve someone else? That evening at Susan's had changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. Before I left, she'd given me a book, its cover worn and pages dog-eared from multiple readings. "This helped me," she'd said, pressing it into my hands. "Maybe it'll help you too." The book was about codependency, about how we teach people how to treat us, about the difference between loving support and enabling dysfunction. I'd read it in 2 days, highlighting passages that felt like they'd been written specifically for me. One line in particular had struck me like lightning. "Setting boundaries is not about punishing other people. It's about honoring yourself enough to say what you will and will not accept." I'd written that quote on a sticky note and placed it on my bathroom mirror, reading it every morning while I brushed my teeth. Slowly, painfully, I'd begun to understand that my children's expectation of endless support wasn't actually love. It was habit, convenience, entitlement that I'd cultivated through years of never saying no. The statistics about elder financial abuse had started haunting me during sleepless nights. I'd read that family members commit the vast majority of financial exploitation against older adults, that it often starts small and escalates. Was that what was happening to me? The thought seemed melodramatic until I calculated how much money I'd given or lent to my children over the past 5 years. The number had made me feel physically ill. Over $40,000, most of which had never been repaid despite promises and payment plans that evaporated like morning dew. I'd decided to stand firm about my trip during a moment of clarity that struck while I was watering my garden. The tomato plants needed support stakes, something to help them grow upward instead of sprawling across the ground where they'd rot. I'd needed support too. Needed someone to help me grow into the person I'd abandoned when I'd become a mother at 22. The Santa Fe trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a lifeline to a version of myself I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten she existed. That evening, I'd sent a carefully worded text to the family group chat explaining that I wouldn't be able to watch the kids because I had non-refundable plans that week. I'd kept it simple, not defensive, just a statement of fact. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Jennifer had called within minutes, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, I don't understand. We already told Amanda's parents you'd do it. They're counting on you." I'd held firm, my hands sweating as I gripped the phone. "I'm sorry, but I made these plans months ago. You all booked your cruise knowing I wouldn't be available." The conversation had deteriorated from there, with Jennifer alternating between guilt-tripping and outright manipulation. Didn't I want to spend time with my grandchildren? Didn't I care about family? How could I be so selfish? The word selfish had echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Was I being selfish? The question had tormented me through a sleepless night where I'd gotten up 3 times to stare at my phone, my finger hovering over the button that would send a message canceling everything. But something had stopped me each time, some small voice that sounded like the young woman I'd been before marriage, and children had reshaped me entirely. That young woman had dreamed of art galleries and adventure, of mornings spent sketching in cafes and evenings watching sunsets over unfamiliar landscapes. She'd had ambitions and desires that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. When had I decided her dreams weren't worth fighting for? The group text that woke me at 2 a.m. had been the final straw, the moment when their casual cruelty had crystallized into something I could no longer ignore or excuse. They'd plotted together, coordinated their attack, tried to corner me into compliance through sheer overwhelming pressure. Robert had been the most explicit. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. Just cancel the hotel and book it for another time. We need you here." The assumption that my plans were disposable, that my desires were negotiable while theirs were sacred, had finally broken something in me that couldn't be repaired. Sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m, I'd made a decision. I was going to Santa Fe. I was going to let them scramble to find childcare. I was going to stop setting myself on fire to keep them warm. But more than that, I was going to make them see what they'd been doing to me, make them understand the cost of their endless taking. I'd started making plans, not for revenge exactly, but for a reckoning, because the truth was, I'd been complicit in my own exploitation. I'd trained them to treat me this way through years of saying yes when I meant no, of prioritizing their comfort over my own well-being, of believing that good mothers sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return. That version of me was done. She'd served her purpose, and now it was time for her to rest. The woman who would board that plane to Santa Fe would be different, stronger, more willing to disappoint people if it meant honoring herself. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I knew it started with one word I'd been too afraid to use. No. Simple, complete, non-negotiable. The weight of that decision settled over me like a blanket, heavy but comforting. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning, I'd called my financial advisor, something I'd been putting off because I'd been afraid of what I might discover. Margaret Chen had been managing my modest portfolio since Tom died, and she'd always been straight with me, sometimes brutally so. When I explained what I wanted to review, she'd gone quiet for a long moment before asking me to come into her office that afternoon. Sitting across from her desk, surrounded by certificates and family photos, I'd felt like a student called to the principal's office. Margaret had pulled up my accounts on her computer screen and turned it toward me, her expression carefully neutral. "I want you to look at this," she'd said, pointing to a series of transfers over the past 5 years. "These are all the withdrawals you've made that weren't for your regular expenses. Do you remember what each of these was for?" I'd nodded slowly, my throat tight. David's business startup, Robert's down payment on a used car, Jennifer's kitchen renovation when she'd underestimated the costs. The pattern had been obvious even before Margaret said anything. "You've depleted nearly a third of your retirement savings," she'd said gently. "At this rate, you're going to run out of money before you need it most. And I know you've told me these were loans, but Margaret, you need to understand something. Money lent to family is almost never repaid. You need to think of it as gone." Margaret Chen had let that sink in for a moment before continuing. She'd pulled out a calculator and started running numbers, showing me projections of my financial future if I continued at this rate. "Look at this," she'd said, turning the screen so I could see the graphs declining sharply. "If you keep withdrawing at this pace, you'll run out of retirement funds by the time you're 75. That's only 13 years from now, Margaret. What happens then? What happens when you're the one who needs help and there's nothing left?" The question had hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I'd been too afraid to face. I'd always imagined growing old with dignity, staying in my own home, maintaining my independence. But these numbers told a different story, one where I'd end up dependent on the very children I'd sacrificed everything for. Would they take care of me then? Or would they find me just as inconvenient as I'd found their demands on my time and money? "There's something else we need to talk about," Margaret had said, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. She'd pulled out a folder with my name on it, opened it to reveal documents I'd signed years ago. "Do you remember setting up that joint account with David 3 years ago? The one he said would make it easier for him to help manage your finances as you got older?" My stomach had dropped. I'd forgotten about that account, had barely thought about it since signing the papers in David's kitchen while he'd rushed me through the explanations, saying it was just a formality, just a way to help me out. "Margaret," Chen had said quietly, "he's been taking money from that account. Not huge amounts, nothing that would trigger fraud alerts, but consistent withdrawals. 100 here, 200 there. It adds up to about $8,000 over the past 18 months. The betrayal had hit me like a physical blow. I'd sat there in Margaret Chen's office, staring at the withdrawal records, trying to reconcile this information with the son I thought I knew. David had always been the charmer, the smooth talker, the one who could make me believe anything. Had he been stealing from me while looking me in the eye and calling me Mom? "What do I do?" I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret had leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. "First, we remove him from that account today, right now. Then you need to decide whether to confront him about this or let it go. Legally, because his name is on the account, it's technically not theft. Morally? That's a different question entirely." We'd spent another hour in her office, Margaret Chen patiently walking me through the steps I needed to take to protect myself financially. She'd recommended I freeze my credit, set up alerts on all my accounts, and most importantly, stop making any loans or gifts to family members. "I've seen this pattern before," she'd said as I was gathering my things to leave. "Adult children who view their parents as an ATM. They don't see it as exploitation because they genuinely believe they're entitled to your support. They tell themselves stories about how hard their lives are, how you don't really need the money, how they'll pay you back someday. But that someday never comes." She'd walked me to the door, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're not a bad mother for protecting yourself. You're actually being a good mother by teaching them a lesson they should have learned decades ago. Actions have consequences, and no one owes you a living, not even your parents." The numbers on the screen had blurred as my eyes filled with tears. $43,000 over 5 years, and I'd seen maybe 5,000 of it paid back. The rest had vanished into my children's lives while I'd convinced myself I was helping them, supporting them through temporary rough patches that somehow never ended. "I need you to do something for me," Margaret Chen had said, her voice firm but kind. "I need you to stop making these withdrawals. If your children ask for money, tell them you've put your accounts in a trust or that I'm managing them and you don't have access. Blame me if you have to. But you need to protect yourself, because they're not going to do it for you." The truth of her words had been undeniable, but accepting it had felt like swallowing broken glass. These were my children, the people I'd given life to, raised with every ounce of love I possessed. How had we arrived at a place where my financial advisor had to tell me to protect my money from them? I'd left her office feeling hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left only a shell. But mixed with the grief was something else, something that felt almost like relief. Someone had finally said out loud what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. My children were using me, and it was time to stop letting them. That evening, I'd done something I'd never done before. I'd written each of my children a letter, actual physical letters on nice stationery, explaining that I needed to have a serious conversation with each of them individually. Not a group text. Not a family dinner where they could gang up on me and dilute the message. One-on-one conversations where they'd have to listen and respond without the backup of their siblings. I'd scheduled them like appointments, sent calendar invites, made it clear this wasn't optional. Jennifer had been first, meeting me at a coffee shop near her office on her lunch break. She'd arrived already defensive, her arms crossed and her expression wary. I'd barely started explaining my financial situation before she'd interrupted. "Mom, if this is about the cruise, I don't want to hear it. You're being selfish, and you're making this so much harder than it needs to be." The word selfish again, weaponized, designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries. But I'd been expecting it this time, had practiced my response during sleepless nights. "Jennifer," I'd said calmly, "I need you to listen to me without interrupting. Can you do that?" She'd rolled her eyes but nodded. I'd laid it out simply. The money I'd lent over the years, the fact that my retirement savings were depleted, the reality that I couldn't keep giving without ending up in financial trouble myself. Jennifer's response had been worse than I'd imagined. She'd laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Mom, you're being dramatic. You're not broke. You own your house outright, and you have plenty saved up." When I'd shown her the actual numbers, pulled up on my phone in Margaret Chen's careful spreadsheets, her expression had shifted from dismissive to annoyed. "Well, that's not my fault. Nobody forced you to give us money." The casual cruelty of it had stolen my breath. This was my daughter, the child I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless sleepless nights, sacrificed my art career to raise. And she was sitting across from me, sipping a latte I'd paid for, telling me that my financial instability was my own problem. "You're right," I'd said slowly. "Nobody forced me. But I'm telling you now that it can't continue. I won't be lending or giving anyone money anymore. I need to protect what's left for my own future." Jennifer had stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Before she could storm out, I'd reached across the table and grabbed her wrist, not hard, but firm enough to make her pause. "Wait," I'd said, my voice shaking. "Just wait. You're about to walk out of here without hearing what I really need to say." She'd remained standing, but she'd stopped pulling away, her jaw clenched tight. "I'm not trying to punish you," I'd continued. "I'm trying to survive. Do you understand that? I'm 62 years old. If I run out of money in 13 years, what happens to me? Do I move in with you? Do you want your children to see their grandmother become a burden because she gave everything away and kept nothing for herself?" Something had flickered in Jennifer's eyes then, something that might have been recognition or fear. She'd sat back down slowly, her anger deflating into something more complicated. "I never thought about it that way," she'd admitted quietly, not meeting my eyes. You've always been there. You've always had enough. I didn't think about it running out." We'd sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop bustling around us, other people's conversations filling the space between us. "Do you know what it's like?" I'd said, my voice soft but steady. "To feel invisible in your own life. To have plans and dreams that get erased every time someone else needs something. I told you about Santa Fe 2 months ago, Jennifer. 2 months. And you didn't ask me a single question about it. You didn't ask why I wanted to go, or what I hoped to see, or whether I was excited. You just nodded and went back to your phone. And then, when it became inconvenient for you, you expected me to cancel it like it meant nothing, like I mean nothing. Jennifer's eyes had filled with tears then. That's not true, Mom. You mean everything to us. But even as she said it, I could see her struggling with the cognitive dissonance. If I meant everything, why did my plans mean nothing? Why were my resources assumed to be available while my time and dreams were seen as expendable? I need to believe that's true, I'd told her, but your actions have to match your words, and right now they don't. We'd talked for another 30 minutes, and by the end, Jennifer hadn't fully come around, but I could see cracks forming in her certainty. She'd hugged me before leaving, stiff and awkward, and said she needed time to think. It wasn't the breakthrough I'd hoped for, but it was something. The meetings with Robert and David had gone slightly better, but only because they'd been more calculating in their responses. Robert had tried the reasonable approach, explaining that the money he'd borrowed had been an investment in his future, and therefore my future too, since he'd obviously take care of me when I was older. David had gone for guilt, reminding me of everything I'd sacrificed for them as children, and suggesting that helping them now was just an extension of that love. Neither of them had apologized for taking without giving back. Neither had acknowledged that their entitlement had helped create this crisis. With Robert, I'd tried a different tactic. You say you'll take care of me when I'm older, I'd said, watching his face carefully. What does that look like to you, specifically? He'd shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We were sitting in his living room, the television muted, but still flickering with images from some sports game. I don't know, Mom. Whatever you need, we'd figure it out. The vagueness had been telling. Would I live with you? I'd pressed. Would your wife be okay with that? Would you help me bathe if I couldn't do it myself? Drive me to doctor's appointments? Manage my medications? Each question had made him more uncomfortable, and I'd seen the reality dawning in his eyes. He hadn't actually thought about what taking care of me would mean. It was just a phrase he'd thrown out to justify continued access to my money. Here's the thing, Robert, I'd said, not unkindly. I don't want to be dependent on you or your siblings. I want to be able to afford my own care, my own life, my own choices. And I can't do that if I keep giving away my future to fund your present. You're 40 years old. You have a good job, a nice house, a family. It's time for you to stand on your own without using me as a safety net. He'd argued, of course, had tried to explain why his situation was different, why he deserved special consideration. But I'd held firm, and eventually he'd fallen silent, his face red with frustration or embarrassment, or both. I'll pay you back, he'd said finally. Every penny. I promise. I'd wanted to believe him, but Margaret Chen's words echoed in my mind. Money lent to family is almost never repaid. They'd both promised to start paying me back, but the promises rang hollow, were vague and non-committal in a way that told me nothing would actually change unless I made it change. I'd left those conversations feeling exhausted, but also strangely energized. For the first time in my life, I'd told my children no, and survived it. The sky hadn't fallen. I hadn't spontaneously combusted from maternal guilt. I'd simply stated my boundaries and held firm, and the world had kept turning. The group text at 2 a.m. had been their last-ditch attempt to break my resolve, to overwhelm me back into compliance through sheer coordinated pressure. But it had backfired spectacularly, because instead of making me cave, it had shown me exactly how little they valued me as a person separate from what I could do for them. I'd spent the next 2 days preparing for what I'd started thinking of as the Great Reckoning. I'd drafted a longer message, one that laid out everything I'd been feeling and experiencing, but had been too afraid to say. I'd shared it with Susan first, who'd read it with tears in her eyes and told me it was the bravest thing she'd ever seen me do. I'd practiced reading it out loud until my voice didn't shake, until I could get through it without crying. And then, on a Saturday morning when I knew they'd all be available, I'd sent the message to the family group chat. It had started with a simple statement. I'm going to Santa Fe next week as planned, and I need you all to understand why this is non-negotiable." What followed had been the most honest I'd ever been with my children, maybe the most honest I'd been with anyone, including myself. I'd explained how their assumption that my plans were disposable while theirs were sacred had made me feel invisible and undervalued. I'd detailed the financial strain their requests had put on me, not to shame them, but to make them understand the real-world consequences of their actions. I'd told them about Margaret Chen's warnings, about the sleepless nights worrying about my future, about the crushing weight of trying to be everything to everyone while disappearing in the process. But I hadn't stopped there. I'd also taken responsibility for my part in creating the dynamic. I'd acknowledged that I'd never set boundaries, had said yes when I meant no, had taught them through my actions that my needs were always secondary to theirs. I'd apologized for not being honest sooner, for letting resentment build until it had poisoned everything. And then I'd laid out what would change going forward. No more loans or gifts of money without a written agreement and payment plan. No more last-minute childcare requests. I'd need at least 2 weeks' notice unless it was a genuine emergency. No more assuming I'd cancel my plans to accommodate theirs. I'd included a line that Susan had suggested. "I've spent 62 years putting everyone else first, and I have maybe 20 good years left if I'm lucky. I'd like to spend them honoring the person I was before I became your mother, the person who had dreams and desires of her own. That doesn't mean I love you any less. It means I'm finally learning to love myself too." The response had been immediate and explosive. My phone had lit up with individual texts, each child trying to reach me separately to either defend themselves or manipulate me into backing down. I'd silenced my phone and gone for a walk in the park, my hands shaking, but my heart surprisingly light. Jennifer had been the first to show up at my house, less than 3 hours after I'd sent the message. I'd seen her car pull into the driveway and had taken a deep breath before opening the door. She'd been crying, her mascara smudged, and her voice shaking with what I'd initially taken for genuine emotion. "Mom, how could you say those things? How could you embarrass me like that in front of everyone?" Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of anything I'd said, just anger at being called out. I'd invited her in anyway, hoping we could have a real conversation, but it had devolved within minutes. She'd accused me of having a breakdown, of being manipulated by my friends at the library, of not understanding how hard her life was. When I'd tried to steer the conversation back to the actual issues, she'd played her trump card. "If you're going to be like this, maybe the kids and I need some space. I won't have them exposed to this kind of negativity." The threat had been clear. Fall in line or lose access to your grandchildren. For one horrible moment, I'd felt the old panic rising, the urge to apologize and backtrack and promise to be better. But then I'd looked at Jennifer's face, really looked at it, and seen not my daughter, but a stranger using emotional terrorism to get her way. "If that's what you need to do," I'd said quietly, "then I'll respect that decision. But I'm not changing my mind." She'd left in a fury, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Robert had taken a different approach, showing up the next day with flowers and apologies that somehow managed to feel both sincere and calculated. He'd admitted that they'd all gotten too comfortable asking for help, that they hadn't realized how much of a burden it had become. But then he'd transitioned into explaining why his particular circumstances made his needs different, more justified, more deserving of my continued financial support. His business was just starting to turn a profit, he'd explained. In another 6 months, he'd be able to pay me back everything and more. He just needed one more loan to bridge the gap, and then I'd never have to worry about him asking for money again. The pitch had been smooth, practiced, and I'd realized with a sinking feeling that he'd probably used similar tactics on investors and creditors. This was who he was, who he'd become, and I'd enabled it by never forcing him to face consequences for his choices. "No," I'd said simply. "No more loans. If you need money, go to a bank." His charm had evaporated instantly, replaced by cold anger. You're really going to choose some stupid vacation over helping your own son? The way he'd said it, voice dripping with contempt, had told me everything I needed to know about how he saw me. Not as a person with my own needs and limits, but as an ATM that had malfunctioned and needed to be fixed. David had been the last to contact me, waiting almost a week before sending a long text message that alternated between apology and accusation. He'd acknowledged that he'd been thoughtless, that he should have appreciated everything I'd done more. But he'd also suggested that my sudden change was unfair, that he'd made plans based on the expectation of my continued support, and that I was essentially pulling the rug out from under him. The message had included a detailed breakdown of his finances, showing me exactly why he needed my help and implying that my refusal was condemning him to failure. I'd read it 3 times, looking for any genuine recognition of how his behavior had affected me, and found nothing. It was all about him, his needs, his struggles, his disappointment in me for not being the mother he needed. I hadn't responded to David's text right away. Instead, I'd sat with it for a full day, letting my emotions settle before crafting a reply. When I finally wrote back, I'd addressed something he'd conveniently ignored: the joint account. David, I'd written, we need to talk about the $8,000 you've taken from our shared account over the past 18 months. Money I never gave you permission to withdraw. I know it's technically legal since your name is on the account, but morally, what you did was steal from me. And you did it while looking me in the eye and asking for loans, making me feel guilty for not giving more. That account has been closed. Your name has been removed from all my financial accounts. If you'd like to discuss this in person, I'm willing to meet, but I need you to understand that my trust in you is broken and it will take more than apologies to repair it. His response had come within minutes, and it was explosive. He'd called me immediately, his voice loud and defensive over the phone. That account was supposed to be for emergencies. I had emergencies. You never told me I couldn't use it. I'd let him vent for a few minutes before cutting him off calmly. David, buying takeout and concert tickets aren't emergencies. The withdrawals are all documented. I've seen them. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've convinced yourself that you're entitled to my money, that my resources exist to serve your convenience. That stops now. The conversation had ended with him hanging up on me, but I'd felt oddly at peace. The truth was finally out in the open, and whatever happened next would happen with honest foundations rather than the lies we'd all been telling ourselves. The week before my trip had been strange and lonely. None of my children were speaking to me, and while I'd told myself that was their choice, the silence had pressed down on me like a physical weight. I'd gone through my normal routines, shelving books at the library and tending my garden, but everything felt different, charged with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. Was I doing the right thing? The question had circled endlessly in my mind during sleepless nights. I'd reached out to a counselor, someone Susan had recommended who specialized in family dynamics and elder care issues. Dr. Patricia Walsh had listened to my story without judgment, nodding occasionally and taking notes. When I'd finished, she'd asked me a question that had hit like a thunderbolt. If a friend told you this story about her children, what would you advise her to do? I'd opened my mouth to answer and found I couldn't, because the truth was obvious and devastating. I'd tell her to protect herself, to maintain her boundaries, to recognize that love without respect isn't really love at all. You're not being selfish, Dr. Walsh had said gently. You're being healthy, and your children's response to your boundaries tells you everything you need to know about why you needed them in the first place. She'd given me some articles to read about codependency and enmeshment, about the ways that families can become toxic without anyone meaning for it to happen. Reading them had been like looking in a mirror I'd been avoiding for decades. My sessions with Dr. Walsh became a lifeline during that difficult week. In our second meeting, she'd asked me to do an exercise that had felt silly at first, but turned out to be profound. I want you to write a letter, she'd said, to your 22-year-old self, the young woman who was about to become a mother for the first time. What would you tell her? What would you want her to know? I'd gone home and sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper, my pen hovering over it for long minutes before I could start writing. Dear Margaret, I'd begun, and then the words had poured out in a rush. I'd told her that becoming a mother would be the most transformative experience of her life, but that she shouldn't let it erase who she was. I'd told her to keep painting, to hold on to her friendships, to remember that she was more than just someone's mother. I'd warned her about the trap of believing that sacrifice without boundaries was love, about the danger of teaching people that they could take without giving back. By the time I'd finished the letter, I was sobbing, tears blotting the ink in places. I'd grieved for that young woman who'd had so much potential, so many dreams who'd slowly disappeared beneath the weight of other people's needs. But I'd also felt something else: determination. It wasn't too late. I still had time to reconnect with that woman, to honor the dreams she'd had, to finish the story she'd started. That letter had gone into my suitcase for Santa Fe, tucked into my journal where I could read it when I needed reminding of why this trip mattered so much. The day before my flight, I'd forced myself to do something I'd been dreading. I'd driven to Jennifer's house unannounced, knowing she'd be home, but gambling that she wouldn't refuse to see me face to face. She'd answered the door with surprise that quickly hardened into wariness. I'd asked if we could talk, and after a long moment, she'd stepped aside to let me in. We'd sat in her living room, the same room where I'd spent countless hours playing with my grandchildren, and I'd tried one more time to make her understand. "I'm not trying to punish you," I'd said. "I'm trying to save myself, and I need you to understand that your response to my boundaries, the way you've all treated me this past week, has hurt more than anything else ever has." Jennifer had stared at her hands, her jaw tight. When she'd finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was hard. "You don't understand what it's like, Mom. You got to stay home with us. I have to work full-time and juggle everything, and I thought I could at least count on you for help." The implicit accusation had hung in the air between us. I'd had it easier, so I owed them more. "You can count on me," I'd said carefully, "but not at the expense of my own well-being. Not when it means canceling plans I made months in advance because you all decided to book a cruise at the last minute and assumed I'd drop everything to make it work for you." We'd talked for over an hour, circling the same arguments and hurt feelings. In the end, nothing had really been resolved. Jennifer had agreed that they'd overstepped with the cruise situation, but she'd framed it as a misunderstanding rather than a pattern of entitlement. She'd promised to be more considerate in the future, but the promise had felt hollow, conditional on me returning to my role as the family's all-purpose support system. As I'd driven home, I'd realized something important. I couldn't make them see what they didn't want to see. I couldn't force them to value me as a complete person rather than just a resource. All I could do was hold my boundaries and accept that there might be consequences, that our relationship might never be what I'd hoped it would be. That night, I'd packed my bags for Santa Fe with hands that shook slightly, but a heart that felt surprisingly peaceful. I'd included my old sketchbook and a set of colored pencils I'd bought on impulse at the art supply store. Maybe I'd remember how to draw. Maybe I'd discover I was terrible at it after all these years, and that was okay too. The point was that I was going to try, was going to give myself permission to do something purely for the joy of it, with no utility or productivity required. The morning of my flight, I'd woken before dawn to find a text from David. "Have a good trip, Mom. I'm sorry for how I've acted. Maybe we can talk when you get back?" It wasn't everything I'd wanted, wasn't a full acknowledgement of the harm done, or a real apology for the pattern of behavior. But it was something, a crack in the wall of silence. I'd sent back a simple heart emoji and finished getting ready. At the airport, I'd felt giddy and terrified in equal measure, like a teenager sneaking out after curfew. Every few minutes, I'd expect my phone to ring with some emergency that would require me to turn back. But the call never came, and eventually, I'd found myself on the plane, buckled into my window seat with tears streaming down my face. A flight attendant had asked if I was all right, and I'd laughed through my tears and told her I'd never been better. It was true. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was choosing myself, honoring my own needs and desires without apologizing or justifying or negotiating. The plane had lifted off, carrying me toward mountains and art galleries and quiet mornings in cafes where nobody knew me as anyone's mother. For one perfect week, I was just going to be Margaret, just me. And that was enough. Santa Fe had been everything I dreamed and more. The light had been different than anywhere else I'd ever been, golden and crystalline, making everything look like a painting. I'd spent my days wandering through galleries, not buying anything because I couldn't afford it, but absorbing the art like oxygen I'd been deprived of for too long. In the evenings, I'd sit on the portal of my hotel with a glass of wine and my sketchbook, drawing the sunset as it set the mountains on fire with color. My hands had been clumsy at first, the pencils feeling strange after so many years, but slowly something had returned. Not skill exactly, but joy, pure and uncomplicated. I'd sketched other tourists, adobe buildings, the twisted shapes of piñon trees. None of it was good, but all of it was mine. On the second day, I'd visited the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and something inside me had broken open. Standing in front of her paintings, I'd been transported back to my college days when I'd studied her work obsessively, drawn to her fierce independence and uncompromising vision. O'Keeffe had left New York at the height of her career to live in the New Mexico desert, choosing solitude and artistic freedom over social expectations. She'd never had children, had prioritized her art above everything else, and while I didn't regret having my children, I found myself envying her clarity of purpose, her refusal to apologize for her choices. I'd spent 3 hours in that museum, reading every placard, studying every brushstroke, and by the time I left, something had shifted in me. I'd stopped in the museum gift shop and bought a small print of one of her flower paintings, something to hang in my bedroom back home as a reminder of who I was trying to become. On the third day, I'd hiked a trail that wound through red rocks and desert flowers, my knees protesting, but my spirit soaring. At the top, looking out over the vast expanse of high desert, I'd felt something shift inside me. The guilt and anxiety that had been my constant companions had loosened their grip, and in their place was something that felt almost like peace. I'd pulled out my phone and taken a selfie, my face flushed and my hair wild from the wind. And for once, I'd liked what I saw. Not a tired mother or a depleted resource, but a woman who was still here, still capable of joy and discovery. I'd met another woman on that hike, a few years older than me, who'd struck up a conversation at the summit while we both caught our breath. Her name was Patricia, and she was from Denver, traveling alone after her divorce had finalized 6 months earlier. We'd ended up hiking back down together, talking about our lives, our regrets, our hopes for the future. When I'd told her about my situation with my children, she'd nodded knowingly. I did the same thing with my ex-husband, she'd said. Kept giving and giving until there was nothing left. It took losing everything in the divorce to realize I'd never had a real partnership. I'd had a dependent who resented me for not giving even more. We'd exchanged email addresses at the trailhead, promising to stay in touch, and I'd meant it. This trip was teaching me that there were other women out there who understood, who'd fought similar battles and survived. I hadn't ignored my children completely during the trip. I'd sent a few photos to the family group chat, pictures of the plaza and the cathedral, careful not to look too happy because some petty part of me didn't want to give them ammunition to criticize my choice. But their responses had been surprisingly warm. Jennifer had said the photos were beautiful. Robert had asked about the food. Even David had engaged, asking questions about the hiking trails. It wasn't much, but it was more than the wall of silence I'd left behind. On my last night, I'd treated myself to dinner at a fancy restaurant I couldn't really afford, ordering things I couldn't pronounce and savoring every bite. A couple at the next table had been celebrating their 40th anniversary, and we'd ended up talking, sharing stories about our lives. When I'd mentioned my children, I'd found myself describing them with affection rather than resentment, remembering the good moments instead of just the conflicts. The wife had reached over and squeezed my hand. "They're lucky to have you," she'd said simply. For the first time in months, I'd believed it might be true, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. Because I'd finally started valuing myself enough to demand they value me too. On my last full day in Santa Fe, I'd signed up for a beginner's painting class at a local art studio, something I'd seen advertised in a coffee shop and decided to try on impulse. The instructor was a woman in her 70s named Rosa, her hair silver and wild, her clothes splattered with paint from decades of creating. There were 6 of us in the class, all women, all traveling alone, all seeking something we couldn't quite name. Rosa had set us up with canvases and acrylics and told us simply to paint what we felt, not what we saw. "Don't think," she'd instructed in her gravelly voice. "Just let your hands remember what your mind has forgotten." I'd stared at the blank canvas for long minutes, my heart pounding with performance anxiety, before finally dipping my brush into a deep turquoise blue. What emerged over the next 2 hours was abstract and messy, nothing like the careful sketches I'd been making in my journal. Swirls of blue and orange, the colors of desert sky at sunset, sharp angles of red for the mountains, and in the center, a small figure in yellow, arms outstretched, taking up space. When Rosa had walked by my easel, she'd paused and smiled. "That's you, isn't it?" she'd said, pointing to the yellow figure. "Finally claiming your place in the landscape." I'd nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. The painting was amateurish and unrefined, but it was also honest in a way I hadn't been in years. Rosa had helped me wrap it carefully so I could take it home on the plane, and I'd clutched it to my chest like a talisman all the way back to my hotel. Flying home, I'd felt nervous in a way I hadn't expected. What would I be returning to? Would my children still be angry? Would they have hardened in their resentment, or would the space have given them perspective? I'd reminded myself that their reactions weren't mine to control, that I could only be responsible for my own behavior and boundaries. The house had felt strange when I'd walked in, both familiar and slightly foreign, like I'd been gone for months instead of a week. I'd barely set down my bags when there was a knock at the door. Jennifer had been standing on the porch, holding a casserole dish and looking uncertain in a way I rarely saw from her. "I made your favorite," she'd said quietly. "Thought you might not want to cook tonight." We'd sat at my kitchen table and talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like years. She'd apologized for the cruise situation, and this time it had sounded genuine. She'd admitted that she'd gotten comfortable expecting me to always be available, that she'd stopped thinking of me as a person with my own life. "I don't want my kids to treat me this way someday," she'd said, her voice breaking. "I need to do better." It wasn't everything, wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. We'd made plans for a real conversation with Robert and David, a family meeting where everyone could speak honestly without defensiveness or blame. I didn't know if it would work, if we could really change patterns that had been set for decades. But for the first time, I had hope. 2 days after I got back, we'd held that family meeting in my living room. I'd prepared for it like a presentation, had notes written out so I wouldn't forget the important points I needed to make. All 3 of my children had shown up, some more reluctantly than others, and we'd sat in a circle in my living room like we were in group therapy, which, in a way, we were. I'd started by reading from my notes, explaining again the financial situation, the emotional toll, the pattern of behavior that had brought us to this crisis point. But then I deviated from the script and spoken from my heart. "I need you to understand something," I'd said, looking at each of them in turn. "I don't regret having you. I don't regret the sacrifices I made when you were young. But you're not young anymore. You're adults with your own families, your own careers, your own lives. And I'm not old enough or sick enough to need caretaking. I'm just a woman who wants to have a life that belongs to her. And I'm asking you to respect that." Robert had been the first to speak up. "We talked about this," he'd said, glancing at his siblings. "After you sent that message, we realized we'd been taking advantage, and we want to do better." David had nodded, adding, "I'm going to pay you back the money from the joint account. I got a second job, part-time, and I'm setting up automatic transfers. It'll take a while, but you'll get every penny back." I'd wanted to believe them, wanted to take their words at face value, but Dr. Walsh's voice had whispered in my mind, "Watch their actions, not their promises." "Thank you," I'd said carefully. "I appreciate that. But I also need to be clear that moving forward, there will be no more loans, even with payment plans. If you need financial help, you need to go to a bank or figure it out on your own. I can offer advice, I can offer emotional support, but my money is no longer available to you." Jennifer had flinched at that, but she'd nodded. "I understand, and I'm sorry I threatened to keep the kids from you. That was manipulative and wrong, and I knew it even as I was saying it. I was just scared, I think. Scared that if you didn't need us to need you anymore, you wouldn't want to be part of our lives." The honesty of that admission had cracked something open in my chest. "Oh, honey," I'd said, my eyes filling with tears. "I will always want to be part of your lives, but I want to be wanted, not needed. I want you to invite me to things because you enjoy my company, not because you need free childcare or a loan. Can you understand the difference?" She'd nodded, crying now too, and we'd ended up in a group hug that felt both awkward and necessary, the first step toward rebuilding something that had been broken for far too long. In the weeks that followed, things shifted gradually. Robert paid back $1,000 without being asked, the first time he'd voluntarily repaid any loan. David started calling just to check in, not to ask for anything, telling me about his work and his girlfriend and his plans for the future. Jennifer asked if I wanted to come to dinner instead of assuming I'd provide childcare, and when I suggested we meet at a restaurant instead, she'd agreed without argument. Were we fixed? No. Did they still sometimes slip into old patterns? Yes. But now when they did, I called it out calmly, and more often than not, they adjusted. I'd started seeing Dr. Walsh regularly, working through decades of codependency and boundary issues. She'd helped me understand that I hadn't failed as a mother by setting limits. I'd actually given my children a gift by forcing them to grow up and take responsibility for their own lives. In one session, she'd said something that had resonated deeply. "You spent so long being what they needed that you forgot you needed something too. You're teaching them now that love means seeing the whole person, not just the parts that serve you." I'd cried in her office, grieving for the years I'd lost and the version of myself I'd abandoned, but also feeling grateful that I'd found my way back before it was too late. I'd also joined a support group that Dr. Walsh recommended, a gathering of older adults who were navigating complicated family dynamics. Meeting every Tuesday evening in a church basement, we'd sit in a circle with coffee and cookies and share our stories. There was Helen, whose son had stolen her identity to open credit cards in her name. There was Marcus, whose daughter had convinced him to sign over power of attorney and then sold his house without telling him. There was Patricia, whose entire family had ghosted her when she'd refused to keep babysitting full-time after her cancer diagnosis. Their stories made mine seem almost mild by comparison, but the common thread was the same: adult children who'd learned to see their parents as resources rather than people, and parents who'd enabled that perception through years of boundaryless giving. Hearing their stories had been both heartbreaking and empowering. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, that this pattern was common enough to be almost epidemic, and that recovery was possible. Some of them had rebuilt relationships with their children. Others had accepted that estrangement was the price of self-preservation. All of them had learned to value themselves again, to see their worth as inherent rather than dependent on what they could provide to others. On my third meeting, I'd shared my Santa Fe story, and when I'd finished, the group had applauded. "You did it," Helen had said, her eyes shining. "You chose yourself. That's the hardest thing any of us will ever do." My story isn't unique, and that's what makes it important. According to research, family members commit approximately 60% of financial exploitation against older adults, and much of it goes unreported because victims feel ashamed or fear losing their relationships. The signs are often subtle at first: requests for money that gradually increase, pressure to sign documents without adequate explanation, adult children who treat parents as an unlimited resource. In my case, the warning signs had been there for years, but I'd been too invested in my identity as a selfless mother to see them. What I learned, what I hope others can learn from my experience, is that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's survival. You can love your family deeply while also protecting yourself from their demands. You can be a good parent without sacrificing every part of who you are. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is say no, because it forces everyone to develop healthier patterns. If you see yourself in my story, please know that it's not too late to change. It's not too late to reclaim your life, your dreams, your right to take up space in your own story. The people who truly love you will adjust to your boundaries. The ones who don't might need to be loved from a distance. 3 months after my Santa Fe trip, I'd returned for a long weekend, this time with Susan. We'd taken that painting class together, hiked the same trail where I'd met Patricia from Denver, eaten at the same restaurant where I'd celebrated my solo dinner. But everything felt different because I was different. I wasn't running away from my life anymore. I was running towards something new. I'd even started teaching a beginner's art class at the library just once a month, helping other people reconnect with creativity they'd abandoned. The class was small, mostly older women like me, and we'd spend 2 hours painting or drawing and talking about our lives. It had become my favorite part of the job, this giving that didn't deplete me because it was freely chosen rather than demanded. The first class had been terrifying. I'd stood in front of 7 women, all strangers, all looking at me expectantly, and I'd almost backed out. What did I know about teaching art? I was barely reconnecting with it myself. But then I'd remembered Rosa in Santa Fe, her gravelly voice telling us to let our hands remember what our minds had forgotten, and I'd relaxed. "We're not here to create masterpieces," I'd told them, echoing words that had freed me. "We're here to play, to experiment, to give ourselves permission to make mistakes and call it art." One woman, Carol, had started crying right there in the library's community room. Later, she'd told me she hadn't picked up a paintbrush since her husband had died 5 years earlier, that she'd forgotten she was allowed to do things just for herself. I'd understood that feeling completely. The support group had also become a cornerstone of my new life. Beyond just sharing our stories of boundary setting and family conflict, we'd started celebrating our victories, no matter how small. When Helen finally blocked her son's phone number after months of harassing calls demanding money, we'd cheered. When Marcus went on his first vacation in a decade without telling his daughter where he'd be staying, we'd raised our coffee cups in a toast. These small acts of self-preservation, once unthinkable, had become our collective rebellion against the expectation that we should disappear into our children's needs until there was nothing left of us. Dr. Walsh sometimes attended our meetings, not as a leader, but as a quiet presence, and her validation meant everything. "You're all doing revolutionary work," she'd said at one meeting. "You're breaking generational cycles of codependency. Your children might not thank you now, but their children will benefit from the healthier patterns you're establishing." My relationship with my children continued to evolve, slowly and imperfectly. There were still moments of tension, still times when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But there were also good moments, genuine moments of connection that felt different from before. Jennifer and I had started a tradition of monthly lunches, just the two of us, where we talked about things that had nothing to do with her children or my money. At our third lunch, she'd surprised me by asking about my college years, about what I'd been like before I became a mother. "I realized I don't really know you," she'd said, her voice quiet. "I know Mom, But I don't know Margaret. The distinction had brought tears to my eyes, and we'd spent 2 hours talking about my dreams of becoming an artist, the friends I'd had, the person I'd been. She'd listened in a way she never had before. Really listened, and when we parted ways, she'd hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you for going to Santa Fe." I should have said that months ago. Robert had actually paid back half of what he owed me, and while I still didn't expect to see all of it, the effort mattered. More than the money itself, what mattered was that he'd acknowledged the debt, had stopped pretending it didn't exist, or that I was being petty for remembering it. He'd even started asking for my advice about his business decisions, not as a prelude to requesting money, but genuinely seeking my wisdom. It was a shift I'd never expected, this new respect for my experience and judgment. David was the work in progress, still occasionally testing my boundaries, but even he seemed to be learning that the old manipulation tactics no longer worked. He'd shown up one Sunday with groceries and cooked me dinner, an apology without words, and we'd eaten together in my kitchen while he told me about the second job he'd taken to pay back the money from the joint account. "I didn't realize how entitled I'd become," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I thought your money was sort of family money, you know? Like it belonged to all of us." I'd nodded, understanding that this was as close to a real apology as I might get, and I'd chosen to accept it as progress rather than demand perfection. And I'd hung that abstract painting from Santa Fe in my bedroom, right across from my bed, so it was the first thing I saw every morning. That yellow figure with outstretched arms, claiming her space in the landscape. On hard days, when guilt tried to creep back in, when I second-guessed my choices, I'd look at that painting and remember who I was fighting to become. Not just someone's mother or grandmother, but Margaret, a woman who painted and hiked and traveled, a woman who had boundaries and honored them, a woman who'd learned finally that self-preservation wasn't selfishness. It was the foundation of genuine love. So here's what I want to know from all of you listening to this. Where are you right now? What city are you in? What time of day is it? Are you folding laundry while you listen, driving home from work, lying in bed unable to sleep because my story hit too close to home? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you agreed with my decision to go to Santa Fe, if you think I did the right thing by standing my ground, hit that like button. I need to know I'm not alone in this, that there are others out there who understand that self-preservation isn't selfishness. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have canceled your trip? Confronted them differently? I genuinely want to know because every story teaches us something, and your perspective matters. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because I'll be back next week with another story, another lesson learned the hard way. And check out the 2 videos I've got recommended on your screen right now. They're about standing up for yourself in impossible situations, about finding your voice when everyone around you wants you to stay silent. Take care of yourselves out there, friends. Protect your peace. Honor your